Let's see how now. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to follow with a similar trend and topic and talk about, I guess, the beginning of the cycle and contraception choice. And let me start with a little bit of motivation. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about that yesterday. If we look at unintended pregnancies in the US, they're very common. About half of the pregnancies each year are unintended. And about 5% of reproductive age women have an unintended pregnancy each year. If we disaggregate these statistics by group, they're not homogeneous, and they're much more prevalent among certain groups. So they're more prevalent among minority women. So the proportion of pregnancies that are unintended among black are 67% versus 40% for white. They're more prevalent for poor women, 61% for those below the poverty line, 37% for those that had that have an income 200% above the poverty line. They're more common among younger individuals and less educated women. So if we look at those that don't have a high school degree, 52% have an unintended pregnancy. 52% of the pregnancies are unintended, and it's only 26% for women who are college educated.
Just to understand, who tells you it's unintended?
So this is reported by the women exposed, and it usually encompasses two things. They either report that they were unwanted pregnancy or that they were mistimed, that they wanted to actually have them later. So, you know, this is probably an underestimate because women, when they have their baby, are quite not so likely to say they didn't want them. So I think, you know, we can actually think that it's a much more prevalent problem than what is reported in those type of data. And you know why we care about these unintended pregnancies is that we tend to find that they are associated with worse outcomes, and it's true for both the mothers and the children. So if we look at mothers who experience this type of pregnancy, they are found to have lower educational attainment and lower labor force participations. If we look at the children, there are also some association with higher crime rates and lower educational, economic, and health outcomes. So these are mostly, you know, association. The causality is a bit harder to prove. So, you know, an important policy question then is why do we observe so many unintended pregnancies despite the availability of effective technology to control birth? And we can broadly think about three main explanations, and they may not be mutually exclusive. So the first explanation I have in mind is related to expectations or belief. So it could be that women in those groups of high unintended pregnancy have misperception about the effectiveness of contraception method. So for example, they may think that quite ineffective methods are actually effective, they're using them and they experience these pregnancies. Another reason may be related to preferences. So, you know, women may not want to become pregnant, but maybe in some of these groups, they do not have such a high disutility if they experience a pregnancy. And so, you know, why bother and make costly contraceptive investment if in the end, you know, I don't mind all that much if I become pregnant. And the other one can be related to cost, which is that maybe these poor women, uneducated women, cannot afford contraception. And so, you know, with the type of data that we have, typically, which would be that we observe women and their contraception choice, we can't really disentangle any of these explanations. And the reason is that you have a basic identification problem. So, you know, if I look at the contraception choices of women, it's driven by their belief about the effectiveness of the birth control method or effectiveness of other, you know, protection against sexually transmitted disease. And it's also driven by their preferences for avoiding a pregnancy, the cost, avoiding a sexually transmitted disease. And you have many combinations of expectation and preference that lead to the same choice. So if I just observe the choice, then I can't really recover the preferences. And, you know, to give a simple example, suppose that in my data I observe a woman who used withdrawal, which is a quite ineffective method. It could be that she has really high disutility for becoming pregnant, but she believes that withdrawal is effective, so she thinks she's making a good decision. It could be that she has low disutility for pregnancy, and she's aware that withdrawal is ineffective. And it could also be that she cannot afford more expensive methods, so she has to go to a cheap version. And so one possibility...
You can't use the US data.
I'm going to look at the US, yeah.
You can't get, okay.
So,
One, though, everyone takes sex education in high school.
so you will see that in the end it's true that they don't have really inaccurate perception, but that's still something that is out there.
And where does abortion come into all this picture, as we were discussing yesterday?
So I'm not going to model really abortion, but I think you can view it as, overall I will try to recover the preference for becoming pregnant versus not, and if you become pregnant, you may be more likely to do an abortion. So one reason why some group may have lower utility for becoming pregnant is that they may find abortion less costly. And we don't have any question to really look at that, so I'm not going to be able to do that. But the fact that we still see a lot of unintended pregnancy in this group means that they don't all get an abortion. But it could be underlying for this, this utility for pregnancy could embed the fact that you have an abortion if you become pregnant. So before that, so one possibility to mitigate this identification problem is to combine data on expectation and choices to make inference on the preference. So if we look at this graph, if I have data on this and this, and I put some structure in the decision-making process, then I can make some inference about the preference parameter. And so
your 50% number before, that
yes.
was, before deciding on abortion and things like that, or that was?
This is reported ex post. So once women, this is coming from the National Survey of Family Growth, so women, report their pregnancy history, and they were asked, did you plan on, was this birth wanted or not? And then they tell you. It's birth, yeah. So, and half of the unintended end up in the abortion. I think that's the figure.
I thought it was more about all the pregnancies, regardless of where they ended up in birth. I thought that's what he was asking. And
so I think this is about pregnancies that are live pregnancies. This 50%, because half of these 50%.
So then it's even more.
Yeah. So actually, I would have to. Maybe you're right. Maybe I have to double check that. Yeah. But I think no, because this is always in terms of pregnancy rate. Yeah. So it's not birth. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's all pregnancies.
Yeah. That's all pregnancy. Yeah. And half of those unintended end up in abortion. Yeah. That's right. Thank you. So what we do here is that we're going to use new data on belief about the properties of contraception method and the contraception choice to first assess whether there are systematic misperception about contraception method's effectiveness, with this idea of understanding whether this is one driver of the high rate of unintended pregnancy in some group. And then I'm going to estimate the disutility for becoming pregnant and preference for other contraception-related outcomes, including cost, to see whether there is heterogeneity there, and again, whether that's one driver for the differences in outcomes. So, if we look at the literature, there is quite a large literature in demography looking at the relationship between contraception choice and demographic characteristics that would tell you, for example, that educated women are more likely to use the pill, but it doesn't tell us what about more educated women make them more likely to use the pill. So we don't really know, the underlying decision-making process. There's a few qualitative approaches, on small scale, looking at asking women preference and belief, and this whole work built on one of my prior work, which was on a small selected sample of college students, where I found, using similar method and data, that the outcomes that matter quite a bit for contraception decision was pregnancy, sexually transmitted disease, and partner's approval. There's also, so here I'm not going to focus on teenagers, but when you think about unintended pregnancy, there is a lot of work on teenage pregnancy, and some work shows that in the US, in states where there is much higher income inequality, teenage pregnancy are much more common, and that's a bit the idea of the economics of despair. This is phrased by Kearney and Levine, where, if you feel you're kind of stuck at the bottom of the income distribution, you feel you're not going to, you don't have really good prospect, then, why not becoming pregnant? And there's also some evidence that institutions matter with welfare, abortion, and family planning policy influencing teenage childbearing for white, but not for black. And, there was already some mention of that. There's some work also showing how the availability of effective birth control method influence female education and labor supply. So what I want to do next is present a simple model of birth control choice, where I will show how the belief kind of matter for the decision-making process, talk a bit about the data, and then try to answer kind of these two questions. Are beliefs accurate? And then look at these preference parameters. So this model, built from, again, an earlier paper of mine where we're going to consider a woman whose utility depends on some binary outcome, such as getting pregnant, contracting a sexually transmitted disease, and the cost of a birth control method. I'm going to assume that the utility is additively separable in those outcomes and linear in cost. And what is critical is that at the time of choosing a birth control method, women face uncertainty about the realization of this outcome. So I know that if I use a method, it's not because I'm using a birth control method, even if it's effective, that I'm going to be able to avoid birth completely. What I'm doing is that by using different methods, I'm shifting the probabilities of this outcome. And so women are going to have subjective belief about the realization of this outcome for each of these methods. So for example, the belief about the probability of becoming pregnant if I use withdrawal. And so each woman will choose the methods that maximizes her subjective expected utility, which will be the utility associated, for example, for having a pregnancy multiplied by the probability of becoming pregnant with a given method, plus the utility associated with not becoming pregnant and the probability of not becoming pregnant. Then this is how much the value cost and expected cost, and then overall the outcome. So what I will recover in the end is that I can rewrite this as the difference in utility level for becoming pregnant versus not, multiplied by the probability of becoming pregnant. And what is key is that I'm going to have data for every individual and for several birth control methods in the population. And I'm going to use this subjective expectation data to make inference on this preference parameter, and I'm going to use expectation cost data to make inference on A.
What was C? I'm sorry.
C is the cost. So this is the cost of a birth control. So it should be CM, sorry, it should be indexed. The price that a woman has to pay. So monetary price to buy birth control method.
For how long? Time price.
So this is going to be a monthly cost. I mean, I can rescale it as I want. Here, when I'm going to look at this outcome, I'm going to look at the realization over a 1-year period, which is usually what medical studies report. So that's the baseline statistic. When you think about a failure rate of a birth control method, you may not know it, but that's usually the chance of becoming pregnant within 1 year use. W is going to be, in the end, something which feature a bunch of these parameters here, and when I'm going to compare utility level, they're going to cancel out. So what I'm really able to estimate is the disutility for getting pregnant versus not. That's a relative disutility.
One thing, I know people notice, for any given method of contraception, an educated woman is less likely to become pregnant. So
yes.
Condoms, right? So.
But that's all right, because what I'm asking every woman is what's the chance that you would get pregnant if you use that method. So I'm not, and there could be variation, and you will see in the data, black women think they're more likely to become pregnant on these women, and they're correct, because they are more likely, like you said, to become pregnant if they use this method.
Do you have some kind of due diligence or something?
So I want to ask them, given the fact how they would use it, right? So if they're not choosing the pill because I think they will forget it every night, then that's optimal for them. And I want to know that belief, right?
So on that topic, what about disutility of use? I might have missed it.
So I'm going to have that these also include side effects. So let me go to the outcome, and then you will see that. It's coming here. So I designed a module that was fielded to a subsample of the NLS Y97 in 2007-2008 when the women were 24 years old. And so I asked probabilistic belief for contraception method attributes. And so I asked about the failure rate, protection against sexually transmitted disease, risk of side effect, interference with romance, and partner's approval. And also the expected monetary cost. And so these are, except the cost, these are phrased using a percent chance format. So what do you think is the percent chance that you would get pregnant during the next 12 months if you were using the pill during that period?
They asked this 12 months because this is how the medical people usually make it.
So yeah, so this is the reason why I chose 12 months.
At this age where people have shorter relations maybe. But
I mean, the thing is that there is no available statistic per act, right? And it depends on the time of the month. And so, yeah, so usually, I mean, if you buy a pack of birth control pill and you look at the leaflet, the failure rate would be based on this 12 months. I think this is the benchmark that women have in mind. Just a bit of descriptive statistic on the sample. So it's a subsample. I have 600 women, 15% are black, 13% are Hispanic, 60% have a high school degree, and 27% went to college, and we have 17% below the poverty status. So, I have enough people in this high group of unintended pregnancy to look at them. In terms of their birth control method use, the most common method is the birth control pill, which is used by 21% of the sample. 20% report having no sex in the last 12 months, so they're not using any method. 70% are having sex but are not using any birth control method. 11% are using condom and birth control pill together. And then we have condom, withdrawal, and Depo-Provera. Depo-Provera is this shot that you take every 3 months, and it's a hormonal method like the pill. And this matches what you get from other data set asking about birth control choice for this age group. And then what is kind of interesting and, underlying that there's something, in this some group of unintended pregnancy. So, I showed that black are much more likely to have an intended pregnancy, and they have also quite different use of birth control methods. So they're much less likely to use the pill than white. They're much more likely to use condom, twice as more likely, and a bit more likely to use withdrawal and Depo-Provera. So now in terms of these beliefs, respondents are asked their belief about 2 birth control methods. The birth control method they are currently using, which could be literally including no method, and then a randomly chosen method between 2, what I call male-intensive methods, because it requires the male partner to do something, which are condom and withdrawals, and 2 female-intensive methods, which are the pill and Depo-Provera. And so everyone is asked about 1 female-intensive and 1 male-intensive method.
What if they are using one of those 2?
So I want to understand their choice. So basically, the way it was designed is that you ask de facto about what you're using, and then you ask about another one.
Okay.
So, so in my earlier work, I had the full choice set, but in the NLSY, I had, 4 minutes or something to ask all these questions, maybe more, but I couldn't ask the belief for all the outcome for all the birth control methods. So let me show you a little bit this subjective belief. So essentially, because women are using them a lot, or because they were randomly asked about it, where I have more observation, are for belief regarding the pill, Depo-Provera, withdrawal, and condom. And this shows the mean, median, and interquartile range for all the outcome. So let's start with pregnancy. So, the benchmark could be what the medical literature report, and they report typically 2 types of failure rate. 1 under perfect use, so that's a bit the diligence issue. So like if the doctor comes and puts the birth control pill in your mouth every day, and then 1 under typical use, which is what you get when you look at pregnancy among women reporting using a method. And so, under perfect use, the pill and Depo-Provera are as effective with 0.3% of failure rate. And this is essentially the median answer that we get in the data. And also the means are pretty low. The next most effective method is the condom. Again, the one under perfect use, it's 2%.
So low number is?
Low number means low chance of pregnancy, yeah. So condom is, again, quite low. There is more variation, so the mean is a bit higher. And then the next one is withdrawal, which is a less effective birth control method. So it matches up pretty well with, what we see in the statistics.
What are those medians? What's the median? Is the real median?
The median, the median is a sample median also. Okay. So it's just because, I want to highlight a bit the dispersion. The mean and the median are quite different. So if we look at sexually transmitted disease, you see that for the pill, Depo-Provera, and withdrawal, the mean is pretty similar, around 30% chance of contracting a sexually transmitted disease during a 1-year period. And the only method which is effective at protecting against sexually transmitted disease is condom, and you see that it's sharply reduced. If we look at side effect,
The median, you say that 50%.
yeah, it's true. The median is because so I think what happened here is that 50% of the women are in stable relationship, or at least some of them believe that they will not get any STD from their partner anyway. So that's the reason why it's low for some women.
So the question is clear that it's about them.
Yeah, it's about them, and it's holding their current how often they have sex and their partner. So they're not supposed to readjust. If I had a more effective method, I would have a lot more sex. This is supposed to hold that constant. This is what we tell them. I should have said that. If we look at side effects, again, you see that the hormonal method, which are associated with more side effects, are associated with higher beliefs in the data. 20%, 35% on average for the pill and Depo-Provera. For withdrawal, we didn't ask. There is no really side effect. Condom is much lower. And then if we look at interference with romance, again, the two methods that needs to be applied during the sexual act are much more, have higher probabilities of interference than the other two methods that you take outside. And the partner is also much more likely to object to male-intensive methods. So men don't want to work too hard. Now if we just look at, this is just showing you, the heterogeneity in belief, because in the end, in my model, the identification will come through this heterogeneity in belief. This is the person's chance of getting pregnant with the pill. It's quite concentrated below 10%, but you still see a spread. For withdrawal, you see a much more, a much larger range.
Sorry, the persons answering those questions before, those were all women or men and women?
So here I'm just showing women, but actually I have a sample of men which I haven't really looked at. Yeah. So unfortunately they're not partnered, so it's independent men. Otherwise it would be kind of nice. Now this is showing whether these are just simple OLS regression about this probability of becoming pregnant, and it shows that covariates explain little of the variation in belief. So this is a bit what Basit was highlighting earlier, is that when you get these data, typically observable characteristics do not explain a lot of this. We see a little bit for black here, and again, this is what we see in the data, is that those black women are more likely to become pregnant on the pill.
Didn't you elicit the probabilistic, the distribution?
So it's about a binary event, so I'm just asking them about what's the chance you would get pregnant on the pill. So there is no distribution here.
So how do they respond? 10 in 100, 1 in 100?
Yeah, it's in a person, so they will say 2%.
Also, you're not eliciting a distribution?
I'm not eliciting a distribution, yeah. So, again, it's this binary event, so they're asked, yeah.
Getting pregnant is thinking they might get pregnant, right?
Yeah, so what do you think is the percent chance you would get pregnant if you use the pill?
So the fact that black women have an elevated probability, does it match with reality?
Yes, exactly. So let me go back to this idea of misperception. So, do women have misperception about failure rate? For that, we need to find some objective failure rate from existing studies, and I'm using a bit outdated study because it provides failure rate by age group, poverty status, and marital status all interacted. So that's allowed me to be quite refined. If we look at, more recent study don't give so disaggregated numbers, but the trend at the aggregate level has been very stable, so there is no reason to think that would change as well. One thing I want to say is that at the individual level, if someone reports something that is different from the objective, it doesn't mean that she has misperception, right? She could have private information about herself justifying this different belief. But when I aggregate at the group level, then if the average is different from what I observe in the statistics, it means that some people are getting it wrong, right? Because at the aggregate level, it should match. And so I'm looking at this kind of accuracy measure, yeah?
But at the aggregate level, you do have the selection into the map, no? So there you only observe those who actually chose that method.
Yeah, so you observe those. So I'm a bit underpowered. I don't find a lot of difference in belief for those using versus not. A little bit for the pill, they're a bit slower. But I don't know if I'm underpowered or not, so I'm going to assume that the selection is not so relevant. But I agree that ideally, yeah, it could be problematic. So these accuracies, looking at the objective minus the subjective. So positive would mean that there is underestimation of the pregnancy risk, and negative an overestimation. And so if this is an explanation for unintended pregnancy, then we would expect that among group with higher rate of unintended pregnancy, they underestimate the risk for less effective methods. And we do not see that. So these are graphs showing this average accuracy measure and the 95 confidence interval. So essentially, if it crosses the 0 line, then it means they have accurate belief. And this is plotted by race and for all these birth control methods. So if you look at black, they have pretty accurate belief. So again, they report higher rates, but they do experience higher rates. So they're kind of aware of their increased risk. The only one where they're slightly below is Depo-Provera, which is a very effective method. But in my data, however I cut it, so here we don't really see it for Hispanic, but women tend to overestimate the risk of Depo-Provera. So it cannot be that this is the only explanation for why some group have unintended pregnancy and not using this method, because you see that among white women there is similar belief.
So how did they get this failure rate from National Survey of Family Group? Because this is retrospective.
Yes.
So they ask a woman, who got pregnant, unintended, unwantedly, and what you were using or something like that?
Yeah, so I think it's irrespective of the status of whether the pregnancy was wanted or not, but they have this contraceptive calendar, and then they also have a pregnancy history, and then they look at, conception during time of use. If we look at poverty level, again, we see kind of similar results. So poor women have accurate expectation about the pill, about condom. Depo-Provera, I've said earlier, they tend to overestimate, but all groups do that. They're actually a bit more accurate than the less poor women. And for withdrawal, we find that they're quite inaccurate, but they actually overestimate the risk of becoming pregnant with withdrawal, which would mean that they should not choose this method if they think it's even less effective than what it is. If I put this in a regression framework, so again, my dependent variable here is this accuracy measure. Here I put in absolute value. So, the closer to 0, the more accurate you are. And what we find here is that, oops, no, I don't have anything I highlighted. Again, we see a little bit effect for black, but what they are is actually more accurate belief than white women. And there is a little bit of action here between married and cohabiting. So married women are the one with the most accurate belief, cohabiting the least. But where we see the higher pregnancy risk is among the single ones. I don't know exactly what to make of that. If we look at, we don't see a lot more going on. So, do women have misperception about failure rate? There is no really evidence in this data of systematic misperception of pregnancy risk among these groups with high rate of unintended pregnancy. So, if you think about policy option, it's not that giving a lot of information would actually help the problem. Maybe it's because, this is taught in school and they know it already.
There's also like Serbia, I don't know where it came, Nancy could remembers, but if you ask if your mother told you how to use contraception, it's much higher in the poor groups.
In the poor,
groups,
Actually, I would be interested to.
This is from At Health, I think.
It's in At Health, I should, Yeah, this is interesting. So next, this led me, I kind of want to discard this as one possible explanation, and I want to move on to this preference possibility. So now what I'm going to do is to use this belief and the choice of a birth control method, combine them to make inference on this disutility for becoming pregnant and all the other outcome I ask about. So the probability of choosing a birth control method, M, is going to be the probability that the subjective expected utility associated with this method is higher than with any other method. So if I rearrange the term, I have this utility parameter here, and the difference at the individual level across the different methods, similar for the cost. So really, my identification is coming from this heterogeneity in belief. And I'm going to assume that this is extreme value type 1 distributed, so I'm estimating a multinomial logit model. So the way you could think about it, it's typical transportation literature where you have train versus bus, how much it costs, how comfortable it is and things like that. Now my attributes for the transport are this pregnancy risk, STD risk, and this is how I'm recovering this preference parameter. So the choice set is going to be, a female-intensive method, male-intensive method, and abstinence. The fact that not everyone is asked about all methods means I cannot use method-specific dummies. So I'm going to have just, a male-intensive dummy and an abstinence dummy. And, okay, something on the sample. So these are this preference parameter. So here, think about it. This is the coefficient associated with the probability of becoming pregnant, and this is measuring this difference in utility level for becoming pregnant versus not. So you can look at which outcome matters in the decision to use a birth control method. This is assuming homogeneous preference, so I'm not looking at heterogeneity yet. So I find that women care about pregnancy, sexually transmitted disease, partner's objection, side effect, and actually the magnitude of all of those are pretty similar. So it's not that I give more weight to one versus the other. The more expensive method give them more disutility, and also male-intensive methods. We don't find much for abstinence here, but this is what this is. Now, I want to look at this heterogeneity in preferences. So I'm just essentially doing some interaction, but the way I'm thinking about it is that this preference parameter is a linear combination of some characteristic. And I'm going to focus on Black, poor, and college degree because these are the populations where I see this high rate of unintended pregnancy. And what I find here, so again, these are the first or the second column is similar to what I had earlier, but now I have this interaction term. And what you see here is that essentially the only group that have very high disutility for becoming pregnant are the college-educated women. This is where we see a very large and negative and very precisely estimated coefficient. And among the other group, actually, this is positive, they don't really have disutility for not becoming pregnant. In this next column, I looked at disutility in terms of cost. So I do the same thing. I interact cost with other characteristics. And here I don't find heterogeneity in the disutility for cost. So it doesn't seem that cost is driving, how much they value the cost of a birth control method, value explain differences in choices. I'm not showing it here, but if you look at other, if you try to look at heterogeneity in the other outcome, I also don't see much going on. A little bit STD, that are more, more disutility for college women, but, not very precisely estimated, and nothing for the rest. So nothing, I also thought maybe partners, because Black women maybe in different type of relationship and things like that, I would see a difference, but I don't see that. If I translate this heterogeneity in preferences in willingness to pay, which I can do because I have the cost parameter, what I find here is that white women with a college degree are willing to pay $260 a month to avoid a pregnancy completely. And, Black women with a college degree, non-poor, about $190. But among the other group, the willingness to pay are very small or even negative, and they're actually not significantly different from zero here. So essentially this, either poor women or Black women are not willing to pay anything to avoid a pregnancy.
How much is the
Sorry?
How much is a month of to pay?
So a month of the pill, it depends a bit on your insurance, but about, most of them, I think the model answer in the survey is $10.
Why are they paying 100?
They're willing to pay. This is how much, even if you were selling the pill for $260 a month, they would still buy it, this group. Yeah.
When you talk about this utility of a pregnancy, shouldn't you also add the cost of the child for the rest of your life, which is just huge?
Yeah, so I think this is...
The pregnancy is not...
Yeah, so I mean, what I'm asking them is, the chance of getting pregnant. So I think this is a very reduced form parameter which captures many things, which is, the cost of a child for your life.
It's like a little house.
Yeah, or even abortion. But what I mean is that, this is supposed to capture that, right? So this is, I think, when you ask him about getting pregnant, this is, so some may abort, but most may keep the child, and this is the whole, cost of having a child.
Kids are income generating in some classes too, right?
Yes. Yeah, so maybe that's the reason. I mean, if you think, so actually that's one thing I want to do, but I don't know if I have enough power or enough data variation, is to look at whether state characteristics or influences this. So for example, if you can get on welfare and it's becoming income generating to have a child, right? If you're now a single mom, so I wanted to see if difference in rules, I'm able to see differences in preference for this pregnancy, but I don't know if the data will allow me to do that. I have only 600 women here. So I do some robustness check, so it's always a bit tricky if you think about abstinence as a birth control method. How should you really model when you think about using birth control method abstinence? So if I look at the sample excluding respondents using abstinence, I find similar results. I do something else, which is assuming that abstinence is in the choice set of those who use abstinence only, so that sex is kind of an absorbing state. Once you have sex, you don't go back to abstinence. Relaxation of irrelevant of independent alternative, assumption, mixed logic, where now sex is a random variable. And we see a lot of heterogeneity there, again, because those who abstain maybe don't value sex all that much. Nested logic, where you first decide whether you have sex, and then the choice of the method, and we find similar results. So I'm not, going to show them in detail. So I'll conclude here. And again, I started this talk with the idea of trying to understand why we see so many unintended pregnancies. And one hypothesis was that there was this misperception about the effectiveness of some method in these groups of high rates of unintended pregnancy. And there is no evidence for this in this data, at least among these 24-year-olds. I don't know if we look at teenagers, whether things would look a bit different. If we look at preferences, we see that, among these 24-year-old women, those who are not trying to become pregnant, only college-educated women have really high disutility for becoming pregnant. And again, the cost, because I didn't find heterogeneity in how they value cost, I don't think that this is a main driver for the difference in choice. And I'll conclude here.
Other questions?
So basically, there are no unintended pregnancies.
Yes. I mean, it's like, I don't really want it, but if it comes, whatever, right? It's a bit like that. So
it's a matter of timing, it's spacing.
It could be so. Or I think it's like, I don't really want a kid, but...
Or I don't want it now, I might want it in 6 months or whatever.
Yeah, so I would actually, I should check better whether the proportion of mistimed, because they both ask unwanted versus mistime among those group. Because whether it's just a question of mistime or not, or whether really it's like, I don't want it, but if I get it, then I'm getting on welfare, and there are other benefits to it. Yeah.
Do you think if you do things sequentially, I always wondered this question. So if you did it by event, then people are going to think I got a 98% chance or 99% chance of not getting pregnant. So it's kind of low, but if you do it 55 times, then the chance of not being pregnant is 1 to the minus 0.99 divided by 55. So if you're thinking about doing it like one event at a time, maybe it doesn't seem so risky. Same thing for drugs,
Yeah, so for HIV, it's widely overestimated. People have asked, the per act, people don't see the difference of the cumulative, don't understand cumulative risk. But in this context, because people report so much this yearly failure rate, you know, so it could be interesting as elicitation purposes to see if the misperceptions are different. But I think this is the one that people are using for the decision-making process rather than per act. And you know, again, for pregnancy, it depends if it's at the right time of the month and things like that. So
in St. Louis, there was a big project about giving long-active reversible contraceptive methods like the IUD. And there was a huge decline in unintended pregnancy from like 150 to 35. Just giving to tens of thousands of women these IUDs for free.
Yeah.
And so how do we think about this in the context of this model? Is this indifferent women who suddenly say, well, if you give me something that works, it just works, but I wouldn't care anyway?
I wouldn't bother. So I would think is that, so maybe, yeah, so, you know, if I want to take this literally, I would say, like, you know, I'm pretty indifferent, but if you give me the IUD for free, I'll just take it, and then yeah, and it will have a difference, yeah. There's another question, yeah.
There's a sociologist and ethnographer at Harvard Works who interviewed single mothers in Philadelphia, and basically in ethnographic work, what you're saying is exactly what she's...
Yeah, so I've seen, yeah. So it's larger scale, but yeah, it seems, you know, there is some anecdotal evidence that, yeah, this is something like that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.